Hi guys, we're gonna get started. My name is Erica Yoon. I'm a 2L here, and
I'm Joe Morley. I'm a 2L as well.
yes, we are co-presidents of Christian Legal Society here. We also have our board members, Alex Rosales and Edward Wang. So we're the faces of CLS if you guys are curious about the organization. And I'd like to just welcome you today to this event that we're co-hosting with the Veritas Forum. The Veritas Forum, just to give a little introduction, has been a very generous supporter and co-host in this event. Veritas is Latin for truth, and Veritas Forum is inspired by the idea that Jesus Christ has something relevant to offer to us in our search for truth, knowledge, and significance. We have our speaker, Alex Harris, and we have asked Alex to share personally, and we really hope that in today's Q&A and discussion, we can all ask honest questions for each other and model a conversation that all of us can continue this afternoon and beyond. We hope that everyone will be challenged, whether you identify yourself as a Christian or a non-Christian, and think of the Christian faith as mystifying, irrelevant, or disproved. Today, we welcome those who bring other backgrounds, perspectives, and commitments to the table, and we honor all questions just as we bring questions of our own. Specifically, the Veritas planning team aims to create events that are relevant and thought-provoking to people of all backgrounds and beliefs, and we really need your help with that. So I think on each table we put a survey card. So for now, if you guys have a pen, we have pencils if you just raise your hand to just write your email addresses for now, and then at the end of today's discussion, we might ask you to fill out a quick 60-second survey. So I know you guys are all eating, but if you could just, write your emails, that would be very, very helpful for us. We won't use your email to send anything except just to gain feedback for the forum and to provide feedback for Veritas. So thank you in advance for doing that. And now we are going to go ahead and introduce our speaker and moderator, and I'll hand over to Joe.
Yeah, so as Erica said, there is going to be a time of moderated Q&A after Alex is done speaking, and we're honored to have moderating the Q&A Professor Janet Brown. Professor Brown is the lecturer and Director of Judicial Clerkships here at Northwestern School of Law, and she counsels students who are interested in clerkships and interacts with judges and meets with them. And before joining the law school faculty, Professor Brown clerked in the 7th Circuit Staff Attorney's Office and for the Honorable Sheila Finnegan at the Northern District of Illinois. And also has experience in private firm and government agency experience in Chicago and New York as well. She also taught appellate advocacy at Loyola Law School for 4 years and holds a JD from New York University School of Law, as well as a master's from the New York University Graduate School, a BA from Tufts University. And our keynote speaker, Alex, is one of Forbes Magazine's 30 Under 30 for Law and Policy in 2017, and is a soon-to-be associate at Bartlett, Beck, Herman, Palancher, and Scott. So Alex recently finished clerking on the Supreme Court of the United States for Justice Anthony Kennedy, before which he clerked for then-Judge Neil Gorsuch on the 10th Circuit. Alex earned his JD from Harvard Law School. Alex, thanks for being here today. We're going to turn it over to you.
All right, you guys are going to have to let me know whether you can hear me okay in the back without the microphone. Are you doing good? Doing good? Great. Let me start by saying thank you to Kyle and the Veritas Forum, to Joe and Erica and the other members of the Christian Legal Society, to Professor Brown, and all of you here who showed up. I was in law school just a few years ago, so I also attended lunch events that held relatively little to no interest for me in order to get free food. And so I just want to say one thing, which I always wished that one of the speakers had said when I was in your shoes, which is, feel free to get up in the middle of my remarks for seconds. I won't be offended. You have my permission. I understand. So this is actually my first time speaking in a setting like this in my capacity as a lawyer. So that's a little different for me, and I'm excited to get to share some of my story and some of the lessons I've learned along the way, and to take your questions at the end. The topic I've been asked to talk about is life after law school. But as you might imagine, it takes more than 2 years after you graduate to kind of master that topic. So I've clerked, I've passed the bar since I graduated in 2015, but I wouldn't call myself a real lawyer just yet, and let alone a wise or experienced one. And all of that is to say that for me to talk about faith and vocation and the law to you, I'm going to be drawing on some of my backstory, so more than just the 2 years since law school. And I hope that that will give you a sense of how I came to be the young and inexperienced lawyer I am today, and some of the principles and values that have guided me along the way. So those are some preliminaries, and now to talk about law, vocation, and faith. Now, law and faith are probably pretty familiar quantities for most of us, but vocation is interesting. You probably, when you hear the word vocation, think, as it's commonly used, an occupation or your profession. We're all part of the, or aspiring to be a part of, the legal profession. And in that narrow kind of career path sense, it's worth acknowledging, and it's important for you as law students to think about the fact that our chosen vocation isn't super great. The studies and the surveys back this up. Being a lawyer is not your ticket to a happy and fulfilled life. In fact, according to some surveys, more than half of all attorneys in the United States are dissatisfied with their lives and careers. One notable study found that lawyers had the highest rate of depression of any occupational group. It's well documented that lawyers suffer from high rates of substance abuse. A recent New York Times profile highlighted this. It was a profile of a seemingly an outwardly successful partner at a California intellectual property boutique who died of a drug overdose. Divorce and suicide rates are similarly high, and if that's not enough for you, according to a 2013 Pew Research survey of public esteem for various professions, lawyers ranked dead last in the public's view of which professions contribute to the well-being of society. Now, much of the blame for these kind of sobering, depressing statistics can be placed on the legal profession's obsession with prestige, with money, and with status. Everyone cares about where you went to law school, your class rank, whether you made law review or have a fancy clerkship, which law firm you work for, and how much you get paid. But according to a 2015 study published in the George Washington Law Review, hardly any of those things positively correlate with a happy and fulfilled life in the law. So if you've never given thought to what it actually means to live a fulfilling life in the law, beyond those kind of fancy baubles that the legal profession shines in your face, if you've never given thought to life after law school in that sense, you should. Because as a profession, we're falling pretty miserably short of our goals. What is the antidote? Well, on the personal level, putting aside all those things I'm not qualified to talk about, like how to reform legal education and the legal profession writ large, but on the personal level, what I would propose to you today is that the antidote is to adopt a bigger, a richer, a broader view of vocation. What I mean when I talk about vocation in this sense is an overriding life purpose or calling. It's much more holistic than just what you do for a living. It's your whole life, how everything fits together. With a vocation like that, your legal and your non-legal skills, your personal and your professional relationships, your money, your time, your platform, whatever those might be, all exist to serve that higher calling. It's about being part of a story that's bigger than you. It's about being part of a story that's bigger than the law or your or my very small part of it. And this is where vocation and faith meet, because throughout history and still today, it is faith that provides that kind of bigger story. Consider just for a moment with me the story found in the pages of the Christian scriptures. A world corrupted by sin, humanity's rebellion against the divine, an audacious rescue mission by God himself entering our earthly existence to suffer, die, and rise again, defeating sin and death on our behalf, who not only saves us from our brokenness, but who saves us from wasting our lives on things that don't matter and that won't satisfy. This is a story filled with themes that resonate with the pursuit of the law. Justice and mercy hand in hand, the equality of all persons made in the image of God, rich or poor, male or female, of every tongue, tribe, and nation, and the protection of the vulnerable, the orphan and the widow, the immigrant, the poor, the oppressed, the vulnerable. Jesus came, he said, to proclaim good news to the poor, proclaim liberty to the captives, and to set at liberty those who are oppressed. But it's about so much more than just the law. This story addresses us as students, as friends, as neighbors, as children, as parents, as spouses, as citizens, and in every role and in every endeavor, it will result in different values and priorities than the world around us and the legal profession around us, but it invites all of us to participate. But all that is pretty theoretical for something that's supposed to filter down into the nitty-gritty of your life. And so that's why I want to take the time to share some of my story. And I don't share my story because it's especially impressive or inspirational. And I also don't share my story under any illusion that I have perfectly lived out the precepts of my faith as we were just discussing. Far, far from it. I share my story because, well, it's the one I know, and because I can't expect you to care what I think about these big reality-defining concepts like faith and vocation if I'm not willing to give you a sense of who I am and where I've come from. So consider this just one imperfect example of how faith and vocation have played out in the life of one young lawyer. I never planned to go to law school. I never planned to go to college. My parents were pioneers in the homeschooling movement, and I was educated at home all the way through high school. My first day of college was actually the first time I ever stepped foot in a formal classroom like this one. And high school for me was self-directed and informal and kind of just mixed in with the rest of life. See, no one in my family had graduated from college, and that didn't mean that education wasn't important. My parents taught me and my siblings to read and to love learning. They trained us to think, to write, and to speak, but they also instilled a really entrepreneurial mindset. They didn't want their kids to settle for the status quo. They wanted us to be reformers, in the best sense of that word, men and women who make the world a better place wherever they happen to be. But college, higher education, was seen as kind of a distraction from all that. Because why would you spend 4 years and tens of thousands of dollars to get a degree to do something when you could just do it? My twin brother, Brett, and I embraced that mindset. So when we were 16, we finished up our high school studies early, and we started a nonprofit organization to challenge low expectations for teenagers. It started as just a website, and we encouraged our peers not to buy into what we call the myth of adolescence, which is that modern notion that the teen years are just this time to goof off and have fun, and real life starts after high school or after college. And instead, we encouraged them to use the teen years as a training ground, as kind of a launching pad for a lifetime of effective service to God and to the world around them. And that message really seemed to strike a chord. But it was around that time that our family and other mentors also began to encourage us to consider going to college. In a real show of humility, my parents and older siblings explained that there are certain doors down the road that simply will not open without the credential that comes with a college degree. And that encouragement led directly to one of the biggest and craziest decisions I've ever made, one of those path-altering decisions that in one way or the other is responsible for everything that comes after. My college search quickly zeroed in on a tiny little school called Deep Springs College. It's a 2-year college on a working cattle ranch in the high desert of Eastern California. It's one of the smallest and the most selective schools in the country. It admits between 12 and 15 students each year, each of whom receive a full tuition scholarship, and most of whom go on to complete their degrees at institutions like Harvard, Chicago, Brown, and Yale, all places that were unlikely to admit a homeschool graduate like me, because it's kind of hard to fully trust a transcript when the signature at the bottom is the student's mom. I promised that my little Johnny deserved an A+ on his English paper. So this was a big deal, and looking at this school, which since its founding in 1917, it had the mission of preparing young men, and starting next year, young women, of high ability for lives of service to humanity. That mission resonated with me. It seemed kind of like the perfect extension of my upbringing. And so when I learned I made it to the second round of the applications process, which was a mandatory 3-day visit, an in-person interview, I was over the moon. I'll never forget my time in Deep Springs. It's an isolated campus. Took a plane ride, 4-hour bus trip, and then another hour drive to get there. The highway actually goes down to a single lane, which is the only time a federal highway goes down to a single lane in the country in order to get over the pass down into the valley. It's isolated, it's beautiful, and the students that I met there were kind of almost everything I'd hoped. They were friendly, they were interesting, they were brilliant. Many, unlike me, had perfect SAT scores, but something was missing. As one student confided to me, most of them had given up on this idea of service to humanity, at least in a tangible sense. For them, if you give food or medicine to one desperate village, that's just increasing the injustice for all the others. So why even bother? The evening after my interview with the applications committee, and all of the applications and hiring and curriculum decisions are made by the student body of this tiny school, one of the student members pulled me aside and said, I shouldn't be telling you this, but what Deep Springs is supposed to give people, you already have that. I think the school could benefit from having you here, but you don't really need Deep Springs. I thought a lot about those words as I made the long drive, bus, and plane ride home. And in a way, he was right, because as amazing as Deep Springs was, I already felt a deep and immediate sense of calling to the work that my twin brother and I were doing with our nonprofit work that increasingly involved opportunities to write and to speak and to travel, which would have been very difficult being at Deep Springs, because not only are they isolated, but they have an isolation policy. They have to get permission from the other students to leave the valley, and they also have very limited technology. It's all part of kind of going into the desert and finding yourself and developing that vision for service to humanity. And so, when I received a call telling me that I'd been admitted to Deep Springs College, the experience of a lifetime, one that would have opened doors that no one in my family had ever walked through, and which came with a full ride scholarship that was the only way my family could have afforded to send me to college, I turned it down. And it was one of the hardest, but one of the best decisions I ever made. For the next year and a half, Brett and I threw ourselves into our nonprofit work. We wrote a book called Do Hard Things, A Teenage Rebellion Against Low Expectations. We held conferences for teens, parents, and youth workers around the country and internationally, and we saw God take our message about teenage potential and use it in some pretty amazing ways. I'll never forget an email we received from a social worker in the Philippines who shared the story of Daisy. Daisy was the oldest of 8 children in an impoverished Filipino family. At age 15, she escaped from a brothel, and in the aftercare home, she was given our book to help improve her English. But instead, she came away convinced that God could use her, a former teenage prostitute from the slums of Manila. When we got that email, Daisy was a high school graduate, and in her second year of college studying legal management. She planned to become a lawyer, the email said, so that she could be a voice for the voiceless. When the time came to go to college, stories like Daisy's and other new and exciting opportunities made it pretty hard to take a step back. But we had become convinced, Brett and I, that whatever work God had for us down the road, we didn't know what that would be, it was bigger, and we needed more training, that we still had a whole lot to learn. And so we chose, in the midst of those exciting opportunities, to go to college. We attended Patrick Henry College, which is a tiny Christian classical liberal arts college in Northern Virginia, just outside DC, and we cut back our traveling during the school year to almost zero. And it was a sacrifice, but it was one that we believed honored God. And it turned out that those 4 years were pivotal ones. I dated and married my wife. I buried my mom after an unexpected diagnosis of stage 4 cancer in the middle of sophomore year. And I welcomed my now almost 6-year-old daughter into the world my senior year. I interned and then worked at International Justice Mission, which is one of the largest anti-slavery organizations in the world. It's one staffed entirely by Christians of all stripes and a whole lot of lawyers who, like William Wilberforce and Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King Jr. before them, take seriously the commands of Scripture to seek the good of the poor and oppressed. And because Patrick Henry had little to offer, when it came to competitive athletics, we had athletics, we just weren't competitive. I competed in moot court and mock trial, which helped me discover an interest in and affinity for the law. All of these experiences, virtually none of which would have happened if I had gone to Deep Springs, helped lead me to pursue law school. And it wasn't because I knew exactly what I wanted to do in the legal profession. It was because I saw a law degree as versatile, and because I believed that it was the next best step in developing the skills God had given me. My law school experience itself was probably pretty typical, but different in some small but real ways from many of my peers, at least at Harvard. coming to law school with a family, my daughter was 8 months old when I started 1L, my obligations to my family and our commitment to faithfully attend services at our local church were more important than school. And that meant treating law school like a 9 to 5, or more realistically, like a 5 or 6 or 7 a.m. to 6 or 6:30 p.m. job. And it meant missing out on classes that met in the evenings. It meant less time hanging out with friends. Even worse, it meant no intramural basketball because those games usually took place at night. It meant, for the most part, not studying in the evenings at all, and restricting my weekend studying to times when my daughter was asleep so I could spend time with her and give my amazing wife a break. And it meant Sunday morning was not a time to sleep in or catch up on reading. All of this remained true for 2 years of clerking, with one blessed exception, which is that there were regular basketball games during the lunch hour at a gym around the street from the Byron White Courthouse in Denver, and, as some of you might know, on the top floor of the Supreme Court building there is a basketball court, the highest court in the land. Maybe my favorite thing about clerking. And I share these details of kind of our daily rhythms and routines, not to say they represent some incredible sacrifice. They don't. But just to give a tangible example, kind of that nitty-gritty I was talking about how different priorities can lead to small but real differences in how we live out our lives as lawyers. Today, I'm getting ready to start my career as a real lawyer, but the story that I'm living isn't any different than it was 10 years ago when I decided to decline Deep Springs. My wife and I decided on Denver over DC because we believed that was what was best for our family and for the larger vocation God has for us. And as I considered where to work, I wanted to go where I could best develop kind of the full complement of legal skills, where I could quickly acquire and start mastering all of the different tools in a legal toolbox. And I wanted to have the flexibility to live out my values and have a life that was bigger than the law firm. And while we're just kind of in the earliest stages of this, my wife and I are in an exciting place because for the first time in 7 years, after years of moving and school and temporary jobs, we're finally able to cast a long-term vision for life rooted in community, seeking the good of our neighborhood and our city, strategizing how to use our income not to raise our standard of living, but to continually up our level of generosity. And this is where all of our resources are being marshaled to make the world around us a better place. That still evolving vision, not my soon-to-be day job, is my vocation. So 2 final points before we move on to some questions. First, I recognize that all my remarks raise legitimate questions like, well, why Christianity? I like your aspirations, Alex, but can't anybody, including people of different faiths and no faith at all, choose to live just and positive and generous lives? And don't many Christians, or so-called Christians, live lives that are marked by just the opposite? The short answer is that I have not found another view of reality that provides an intellectually and emotionally satisfying basis for justice, for morality, for equality, or the idea of human rights. I have not found another that purports to present truth with a capital T while simultaneously making clear that any form of pride or oppression by its adherents is a twisted perversion of its message. And I have not found another that provides a foundation for meaning and an enduring joy when all the good things of this life, health, wealth, reputation, relationships, are stripped away. Faith is often viewed, both within and outside religious communities, as kind of a blind belief, the well-worn leap of faith. But faith in Scripture is a reasoned and a reasonable reliance that is rooted in historical fact, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, as foretold hundreds of years before by the Old Testament prophets. If you've never confronted this evidence for Christianity, or if you've never confronted a vision for the Christian faith beyond the co-opted cultural shell of Christianity that is so prevalent in the United States, I encourage you to take a look. And I have 2 books to recommend, both by Tim Keller, a Christian pastor in New York City. The first is called Making Sense of God, and the second is The Reason for God. Making Sense for God is a positive case for why faith and Christianity are worth your time. And it is worth your time. The latter, the second book, The Reason for God, addresses many of the intellectual objections that people legitimately have to faith, like the existence of evil and suffering in the world and the way that Christianity has been used throughout history to justify oppression and other atrocities. So Making Sense of God and the Reason for God by Tim Keller. Second, and finally, I can't emphasize enough that living as part of this bigger story is not some secret mechanism for achieving professional accolades. It's not about using the affluence of the legal profession to be big-hearted and pat yourself on the back. I recognize that the opportunities that God has given me are a big part of the reason why I was even invited to talk to you today. But if I gave you or left you with the impression that my sense of well-being or my worth is tied up in those things, I'll be doing you a profound disservice. When I grow up, I want to be like my twin brother. Brett is a better speaker and a writer than I am. One profile of us back in our conference days said that Brett had the persona of the world's coolest youth pastor, while I came across like someone trying to sell you a timeshare. Guess which one of us became a lawyer? But our nonprofit work, our book, our conferences, all of the things that opened doors for me in law school and beyond, Brett was an indispensable and equal partner in all of those. If he'd wanted to, he could have been the one standing up here talking to you about law and vocation and faith. So what is Brett up to today? Well, for the past 5 years, beginning just after he got married, Brett has been the primary caretaker for his wife, Anna, as she has suffered from a devastating combination of Lyme disease and mold poisoning. For most of those years, Anna, a brilliant and vibrant dancer when they got married, was bedridden and entirely dependent on Brett as her body and mind fell apart. He has dropped everything to lay down his life for Anna. 6 months ago, things got so bad for Anna that they were forced to abandon most of their earthly possessions and every support system and basic luxury, pursuing a treatment plan of extreme avoidance, literally camping in the desert in the middle of nowhere, miles from civilization. And somehow Brett has walked through that living hell while maintaining a profound hope and a willingness to serve his wife that is simply not of this world. And somehow, despite everything that they have gone through, Brett and Anna have a shared vision for a life of radical generosity that is a big part of the inspiration for me and my wife. What Brett is doing now, what he has done for the past 5 years, dwarfs the significance or the difficulty of anything I've accomplished in the law. But while our paths are outwardly different, Brett would tell you we are living the same vocation, the same life purpose, to faithfully follow our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, to love and to serve like he did wherever we find ourselves. We are both part of the same bigger story. Thank you all so much.
So now we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit because we did promise a question and answer period. So we do have some prepared questions we're going to go through, and then once we run out of those, if we do have time, we'll open the floor for you guys to ask any questions regarding faith, journey, and also, if it's okay with you, your time clerking, which I know is, I think, primarily what we're going to do. So there we go. You guys want the microphone?
I'm okay.
I'm
We're
good.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here. And thank you, Alex, for those comments that I found very reflective and insightful. And I think one of the things I drew from that, which I hope you did as well, excuse me, I have allergies, is this idea that we need to be self-aware. Our profession doesn't always encourage us or allow us the time to step back and be reflective about our experience. And so it's very easy as a lawyer. I can tell you I found myself in this position before, where years pass and you say, I'm unfulfilled, how did I get here? So I think one of the lessons we can extract from your remarks are that it's incumbent on us to take those times to reflect and ask, am I integrating my values into my choices in life? So. All right. Well, I thought we'd ask a few questions about the clerking experience, because everybody's always dying to know what happens in the Supreme Court. And Alex probably can't tell us all the good stuff, but we'll ask a little bit anyway and see what he can share with us. So perhaps you could start by just telling us a little bit about your clerking experience, what you found valuable, and if you have a memorable experience you want to share.
So clerking is great. I highly commend it to you. It is basically you're working for a judge right alongside them. You're helping them with all of the research. You're helping them by making recommendations on how the cases should be decided. You're helping them write the opinions oftentimes, whether they include any of the language that you authored or not. And every judge is different in that respect. You are learning by seeing what they like and what they don't, and how they write after years and years of success in the legal profession. So you're also getting a behind-the-scenes picture of how legal decisions are made. So in law school, a lot of your reading is opinions by appellate courts, and if you have an appellate clerkship, you're actually seeing how the sausage gets made, which is both encouraging and discouraging and illuminating in any respect, and gives you a really valuable window into how the law works and develops that employers really value, but that is just an enriching experience for you, especially as you're starting off. So I was very blessed to have 2 years to clerk where I was able to figure out what do I actually want to do in the law, because I came to law school and I think my thought was, well, law school is versatile, like I said. You could go into politics, you could go into business. If you really had to, you could practice law. And, and over law school and clerking, that flipped for me. I spent a lot of time with some of those kind of consummate politicians at Harvard Law School and realized those are my favorite people at the law school. I really like my law friends, and I actually really love the law, and that was illuminating. And then going to clerk, even though I clerked for appellate judge and a justice, both of them were in private practice litigators who went to trial and tried cases, and hearing their war stories made me realize, oh, you know what? Even though appellate law is something that a lot of people who clerk are just dead set on it, I actually am interested in the trial side. And having those 2 years after graduation to do some really substantive, interesting, exciting work, but also figure out what I actually was interested in was really valuable. Whereas if I had just kind of gone straight through, I think it would have been easier to get stuck somewhere and just be, oh, well, this is what I'm doing, and so this is what I'll do for 3 or 4 years before I, check back in and say, is this really what I am interested in? So it's a valuable opportunity to take that time to reflect.
It is. It's a nice sort of transitional role because it does allow you that time to explore, which you don't always get when you're solely focused on client. Are there any differences between clerking for an intermediate appellate judge versus a Supreme Court justice?
It's actually, a lot of it's very similar. So it's still research and writing. You write bench memos, kind of recommendations to the judge or justice, what you think they should do or questions they should ask at oral argument, and then helping draft opinions. So that's all similar. It is different in that the Supreme Court, just the volume and the variety of the cases and the issues that come before the justices and across your desk every day is just incredibly high, because there's 7,000 or 8,000 petitions for certiorari that are filed every year, and the court hears only about 70 or 80 cases, and that's kind of been slowly going down every year. And so the first cut and the way to winnow that down from 8,000 to 80 is the law clerks. So you are looking at tons and tons of petitions and reading tons and tons of lower court decisions and making recommendations on all sorts of different legal topics in the course of a day and a week, and that variety is really fun. Another difference with the court versus the appellate court is that on the Court of Appeals level, usually clerks can't talk to clerks in other chambers about cases. It's much more, keep everything close to the vest. At the Supreme Court, you can't talk to anybody, and everyone wants to know what's happening outside of the court, but inside the court, everyone talks. And so you have 8 other clerks who are all brilliant and reading all the cases and reading all the briefs, and you can go and talk to them and get their perspective, and it's just an incredibly stimulating and an exciting environment to help your justice out alongside those other clerks.
So sadly, we cannot all clerk for the Supreme Court of the United States. But what advice would you give students more generally about whether to pursue clerking and about how they can position themselves to be successful in a clerkship search?
Well, they should attend your March event
Thank
where
you.
you talk about clerking and give information that would be helpful for them. So that's the first thing. A lot of the basics are pretty basic. It's do really well in your exams, develop and demonstrate your writing ability. That's kind of the basics. The parts that people don't necessarily know, especially coming into law school, some people, until an event in March may not really know what is clerking and why would I want to do that. And so what people don't usually know is how important recommendations are for clerking. So as 1Ls, you are potentially developing recommenders just in your participation in class and in your visits to office hours and in your exams especially. And so it's important to start developing those relationships because ultimately judges have lots of smart people with good grades who apply to clerk for them, and what they want is someone who's willing to go to bat for you and say, look, this person is great, or they're great for you specifically, and really willing to give you a positive statement that you could be a great clerk. And that is a big distinguishing factor, both on the Court of Appeals level, also the Supreme Court, is having someone willing to go to bat for you.
Thank you. And for the unsolicited pitch, which I promise I didn't ask him to make.
She did not.
All right. So when you first came to law school, what sort of vocational or other goals did you have in terms of the career path you intended to pursue? And has that stayed consistent, or has it evolved or changed in any significant way?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I was saying earlier, I did originally think, oh, Harvard, politics, that would be cool, I'll do that, or maybe business. I have an entrepreneurial background and mindset like I talked about. And that did evolve pretty quickly because I realized the law is actually really interesting. I like the people, don't like these people as much. I don't want to be that kind of person. Don't want to spend time with those people all the time. And so that was helpful. And so I feel like I'm certainly not one of those people who went to law school knowing exactly what they wanted to do. If anything, kind of all of my expectations kind of got flipped over the course of law school and clerking.
Was it ever challenging if you felt like you were pursuing a different path or going upstream against the sort of trend of what others in your class were doing or aspiring to do?
Not really. I think honestly that my friends who were committed to a different path, to public interest work, to not go into a law firm, to maybe not pursuing clerkships even if they were qualified and capable of doing it because they had a real vision for service. Those were the people who I think more often than not feel like they're kind of going against the stream of the rest of law school, because there's kind of, just like for a lot of people, going to college is just like, well, everyone goes to college, or that's what you're supposed to do, or you're supposed to try to do that. And then with law school, oh, you're supposed to go and do these things, and that's just what everyone does. And if that's what you've thought about and decide, like, this is how I see my skills fitting, and I have a vision for how to use that as a platform for meaning and significance, and having an impact on the world, that's great. But if it's just a lockstep type of thing, that's where you run into problems. So my law school experience was a lot of my friends who had a real clear vision for what they wanted to do and how they wanted to serve using their law degree. Those were the people who were really pushing against the stream.
Yeah. And I think you already touched on this in your comments, but just in case you have anything else to add about how your religious faith has shaped the decisions you've made in terms of your career path. Has it compelled you to approach things or make different choices than you would not have made otherwise?
Yeah, besides kind of what I already said in my prepared remarks, and I won't kind of go over that again. Not a whole lot of like big things. I mean, there are small things. So, alcohol is a big part of the legal profession, and while I drink, I do it in moderation. And there are times when that's felt like a decision that is puts you on as an outsider in certain legal circles. Maybe one of those legal reforms or things that needs to be addressed to up levels of lawyer fulfillment and happiness. But nothing huge. I think clerking, you are generally put in a position where you have beliefs, you have opinions on how cases should come out, but you are an agent for the justice or the judge, and you make your best case. And at least in my perspective, my kind of religious convictions, my moral convictions are very different, and there's a totally different category than my political or my ideological or policy views. And so, I can make my best case, but if the justice or the judge decides to go this direction, my job is to implement that. And in my experience, these are men and women who are striving to be impartial and to make decisions with integrity, and so I can fulfill my role as an agent there. In private practice, I think there are a lot more temptations because you have a client and your goal is to try to get this win for the client, and you're making a lot more decisions for yourself on what ethical lines and moral choices you are willing to live with, and that will be more of a challenge. And so I expect that as I move into my career, there will be more opportunities for my faith to inform some of those decisions, to be honest, to be fair, to be just, even against interest, because it's right.
Yeah, and as you've noted, it's somewhat easier, I think, when you're clerking for a judge because the ultimate decision isn't yours to make. Do you have any thoughts moving forward in terms of practicing law, how you might handle it if some of those conflicts arise between your personal belief and your client's interests?
So I haven't started yet, so it'll be all new and exciting for me pretty soon here. In law school, as someone who took my faith seriously, I was just pretty open about it, so it wasn't some surprise to people if they found out, like, oh, Alex can't come to the Sunday morning meeting. They kind of like, oh, I'm sorry, I should have thought of that. Like, I'm sorry, Alex, I know you always, go to church with your family. And even just being open about it, I think is helpful, so that if there's a situation where I have to explain, look, I'm not comfortable with this, it's not kind of coming out of left field for them. They know, okay, we understand this, we know that's who you are, and so we'll respect it. And even if they don't, then you take the consequences of that. But I think being open ahead of time, and then living a life of integrity so that people see that and respect that is important to lay the groundwork for making some of those hard decisions.
An important guidance generally, because many people, I think, it's easy to lose sight when you're so focused on your client's interests about whether it's the right thing to do. Sometimes, again, you need to be able to step back and reflect on that. Some lawyers sort of lose their way and do something, the extreme, obviously, doing something unlawful
Yeah.
because they're focused on their client's interests and not on whether it's the right thing to do.
Just really quick
Sure.
on that point, I don't know if any of you have taken the MPRE yet, which is the ethics test that you take as part of the process of taking the bar exam. And different states have different scores that you have to succeed in order to be a licensed member of the bar in that state. But the wisdom on how to pass the MPRE is to always find the most ethical answer and then scratch that one off and then go with the second most ethical answer. And then, of course, the whole test is like graded. You could get most of the questions wrong and you still pass. So it's just like minimum ethicalness. So that's a window into some of maybe the bar is a lot higher than it normally is set at. You need to aim a little bit higher on that front.
And then one final question, excuse me, before we open it up to the floor. Start thinking about your questions. So obviously, we think we can plot out these career paths and life plans, and then your path veers off in ways you never could have anticipated. But that said, how do you envision your career progressing from here, and how your faith will play a role in that? And what advice, if any, do you have for our students who are interested in integrating their values into their work as lawyers?
I think it goes back to what you said earlier, which is taking the time to think about it deeply. And so over the course of this past summer, all those statistics, those really sobering statistics I was telling you all about, I was reading articles. I read that 2015 George Washington Law Review study in the course of trying to decide, well, where am I going to go work and what do I want to do after clerking? And that was really helpful because it a lot of times you can say, like, oh, well, what's the most prestigious job and what pays the best? And it turns out none of those things make you happy. And so if you haven't thought about that, it'll be easy to be led astray, be easy to do the lockstep thing where you just do what everyone else is doing, like I talked about earlier. So just taking the time to think about it, and I know law school is busy and crazy and stressful, but life doesn't slow down usually and give you some great long time to just think about things. So starting now to start thinking about it is important, because again, you can get locked in and just find yourself 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 or 15 years later being like, oh, well, how did I get here? And if you've never given thought to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And in many of life's choices, this idea of being intentional and purposeful rather than just sort of letting things happen. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, let's open up the floor to questions. Who has something they'd like to ask Alex? Now is your opportunity. Don't be shy. Yes.
Yeah.
So I was curious, you made a comment in there that working in a clerking position, it's encouraging and discouraging to see how the sausage is made. I was curious if you have a specific example, or I guess things that you've experienced that
Definitely,
are
I
particularly
have no
encouraging.
specific examples I can share with you. I think it's just that you're working with people, and people are flawed, and there's a lot of people who have very good intentions who just have different views of how the law works and the role of a judge or a justice, And so you kind of mix all of that together with some really controversial issues, or even just some really difficult questions. Cases don't go to the Supreme Court unless the lower courts disagree, but like 90% of all decisions, or a higher number than that, of all decisions are unanimous, and it's only the tiny fraction that cause widespread disagreement and need to be cleared up by the court. So you're dealing with hard questions and people with good intentions but who are flawed and who have very different views on the role. And so seeing all of that play out, especially if it kind of ends up in a way that you don't necessarily agree with or think is best, that's kind of the sausage that you're seeing get made, and some people have a much more cynical attitude towards it. I tend to be a little bit more optimistic by personality, and so I see a lot of good there. People are trying, even if they don't always succeed in living up to their view of what they're supposed to be doing. But there's kind of a mixed bag of that you see when you are behind the scenes, seeing how it actually happens. And I'm sorry I can't share specifics.
You can go clerk and have your own experience. Yes, I'm back.
Hey, I was wondering how, especially early in our career, you thought about this, or we could think about that balance of staying relevant to power, but also being generous in our lives. So, I mean, we see people who follow that prestige track and make a big difference on a macro level later, but then your brother does so much at a micro level. Like, how should we think about that?
Yeah, so the question for the recording's sake, in case people couldn't hear it or the video didn't pick it up, is how do you balance being relevant to power with also being generous and kind of making a difference on the micro level versus kind of the big macro level. And I think you have to, there are different seasons of life. So right now, Brett is really focused on serving his wife. But even now, as she slowly gets better, she's been able to start writing about her experience in a way that's really touched a lot of lives. And I think that will continue, Lord willing, as she continues to get stronger and better. And so there could be a time when suddenly, the story that comes out of that season of intense micro focus turns into an opportunity to bless others. And likewise, right now, I just finished clerking at the court, which is a position of, at least relative power for a pretty young lawyer. But now I'm going to go be an associate, and my relative power is going to be significantly smaller. And so my focus is going to be much more on my neighborhood and my community and my church, and that's a much more micro type of focus. And that may change in 10, 15, 20 years. So I think there's really, it evolves over time, but the important thing is to kind of be part of that bigger story so that you see that this is a good and worthwhile endeavor, regardless of which situation you find yourself. Certainly, I think Christians, especially over the last century, have tended to not be in the halls of power and to abandon the academy and to abandon positions of influence over to other views of reality, and there's something to be said for having people in that space who can winsomely share and represent those views. But there's also a lot of hurting that happens on the ground, and people need to be addressing that too. And ideally you're doing both and straddling those worlds in your family and with your friends, with your community, regardless of what your kind of day job and title is as a lawyer.
Yes, and I was just going to ask, how do you feel that you sustain your focus on that is bigger than you? I feel like a lot of times, especially in law school, you're around your accomplished classmates and you kind of lose focus that I have a bigger purpose and this is meant for something bigger. How do you feel that, other than attending church, that you remain focused through all of that? I don't know, maybe that's a loaded question.
Yeah, no, that's great, and this is a classic example of how I have not perfectly followed out my faith, because what I would tell you, this is what you should obviously be doing every day, is not necessarily what I've always done every day. It's more a work in progress. But I think beyond attending church, having daily opportunities to think and to pray and to read Scripture, for those who are not Christians, I think there's kind of increasing recognition of the importance of having times like that to be mindful and to self-reflect, and kind of recognizing some of the wisdom of that a lot of religions have recognized for centuries, and all of that kind of goes into it. I think specifically for me, church has been a big one. Kind of going to church and hearing the preaching and worshiping and listening to the lyrics of the hymns, reminds me that I'm small and there's a much bigger reality out there. And that's helpful, and I think that's one of the blessings of being a faithful attender to church, even in the midst of the craziness, because the temptation is when things are crazy, you stop doing those things when actually that's when you really need it, because otherwise you'll kind of get lost in the shuffle. But also family. So having a wife and a daughter for whom I'm just husband and dad, and not, first and foremost law student or clerk or whatever, is really grounding. Having a family that knew me back when my haircut was really pathetic and I said lots of stupid things, and who remind me of that is grounding. And so having that support system, to the extent that you have it, and drawing on that is also really helpful, especially as you move into circles where you can feel like, oh, everyone else has it figured out, everyone else is understanding this material and getting ahead, and everyone else is a rock star, and I'm just trying to keep my head above water. Having that grounding is really important. Because everyone feels that way in law school.
And I would add as well that also some of the choices you make in terms of how you choose to practice law and who your clients are can affect that as well.
Yeah.
In terms of working with people with real problems, it can give you some perspective.
Right, so I think that might be it for us on time. However, Alex is generous to be at Harry's right afterwards if you guys want to, kind of have more questions for him, just, engage in some casual conversations with him. And thank you so much to Professor Brown for moderating, and thank you, Alex, for speaking. Let's just give them a big round of applause. And also to the Veritas Forum for being, co-hosting this with us and making this possible. We just have one last favor. I know each of you have your survey cards in front of you. If you could just take 1 minute to fill it out, it's very helpful for future events, for people like us, and for Veritas to go to other schools and back at Northwestern, hopefully. So if you could do that, and just as you make your way out, if you can just leave it on that table, that would be wonderful. And with that, I think it's a wrap. Thank you so much, guys,
thank you everybody for
showing
coming.
up, and hopefully this was engaging and helpful. Again, Alex will be at Harry's, and so please join us if you don't have class or other commitments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.